It's just a real honor that we were able to have Vice President for Research at Indiana University, Fred Cate, here to be our closing speaker of the day. Vice President Cate specializes in information privacy and security law issues. He's testified before numerous congressional committees and speaks frequently before professional, industry, and government groups. He's a senior policy advisor to the Center for Information Policy Leadership at Huntoon and Williams, a member of Microsoft's Trustworthy Computing Academic Advisory Board, Intel's Privacy and Security External Advisory Board, the Department of Homeland Security Data Privacy and Integrity Committee, Cybersecurity Subcommittee, the Department of Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency Privacy Oversight Board, the Board of Directors of the Privacy Projects, the Board of Directors of the International Foundation for Online Responsibility, and the Board of Directors of the Kinsey Institute for Research in Sex, Gender, and Reproduction. That's a pretty impressive list of things that Fred's involved in. So he's going to speak with us this afternoon about data and privacy, and it's my pleasure to welcome you, Fred.
Thank you very much. I couldn't be more delighted to be here. I should tell you, I've come from the eye doctor, so I can't see really any of you. And I suddenly realize I can't see the paper in front of me either. So it gives me the chance to talk about what I really want to talk about rather than maybe what I had advertised I would talk about. So let me say I had entitled this talk Security versus Security, and I thought what might be at least interesting for me, if not for you, would be to sort of lay a foundation for perhaps a discussion. I would be very interested to hear your views, since I suspect you know more about these subjects than I do, about the tension between the government's apparent and increasing demand for backdoor access into secure devices. And rather than focus on the privacy issues, which is where I usually focus, and of which there are many, to instead focus on the security issues involved in when the government says we want a guaranteed way into a device. So let me start with what I hope is very familiar territory. You're undoubtedly all recall that at the start of this year, 2016, the FBI approached Apple through a court and said, we would like you to remove some of the security functions on the iPhone that had been obtained from one of the two San Bernardino terrorists. This was not a happenstance approach. The FBI had been looking for months for a test case in order to see if they could compel an equipment provider to reverse its own security protections. And this was decided to be one of, in fact, 11 test cases that the FBI brought. In this case, again, you know as much or more about this than I do, the challenge was not that the FBI wanted Apple to break its own encryption, because in this case, Apple had changed its behavior so that it no longer had the key to the encryption on the phone. Instead, that key was created through an intersection of an embedded key that was in the hardware and the user-created password. The two together, when intersecting, created their own unique key, and that was the key that the FBI hoped it could brute force attack if only it could get Apple to eliminate the other security protections. So what were these other security protections? Well, one was that Apple required that the passcode be entered via the keyboard. You couldn't enter it by connecting another computer and doing it electronically. A second was that Apple enabled a user-controlled switch, which would effectively kill the iPhone after a certain number of wrong password guesses, 10. They didn't know whether that was enabled or not for this iPhone, but they understandably feared that if they just started guessing passwords, they would discover it. And the third was that there was a time delay built into each try of the password. And although this time delay was only 80 milliseconds, when you're trying tens of millions of password combinations, 80 milliseconds is a long time. Now, there was a lot that was not known, that we still don't know, about that iPhone. For example, did it have a 4-digit password? Did it have a 6-digit password? It could have had either. But as a practical matter, a 4-digit password could have been broken in minutes if you could use a computer and not have a time delay and not face a limited number of tries. A 6-digit password could have taken a day or longer to crack. So the FBI's belief that if it could just get these 3 security measures removed, that then it could do a brute force attack was not an unreasonable belief. Right? And some have criticized that belief, and of course we don't know whether it would have been true or not, but nevertheless it was a reasonable thing for the FBI to think that it could do. The law under which the FBI sought to compel Apple to do this, and I swear this is the only bit of law I'm going to talk about, so you're absolutely safe, is a 1789 statute, which you can imagine had a great deal to do with encryption when it was written, that empowers federal courts to, and I'm quoting, I'm trying to quote, all writs necessary or appropriate in aid of their respective jurisdictions and agreeable to the usages and principles of law. So let me just read this once again because it's not written in ordinary English. So the All Writs Act gave courts this basic power to issue orders, all orders necessary and appropriate in aid of their respective jurisdiction, in other words, only where they had jurisdiction to operate, provided that those orders were agreeable to the usages and principles of the law. So this immediately provoked a firestorm of protest, as you undoubtedly know, in part because Apple chose, rather than to respond in court, although it certainly did respond in court, to respond publicly. And Tim Cook released a letter to customers and shareholders, which was subsequently published in newspapers and, of course, then made available online, in which he argued that far more was at stake here than access to this one cell phone. Effectively, what the company was being asked to do, according to Cook, was to rewrite its own software, its operating software, and then to take advantage of the fact that it digitally signs its software, to digitally sign the new software, the revised software, and install it on the iPhone, something which would not be possible today, but was possible with the iPhone involved then. This was an iPhone 5, which was to install, to update the software without first entering the user's unique password. So there are a variety of sort of challenges here that Apple raised, and not all of these are necessarily automatically credible. Just because Apple says them, I don't want to assume that they're all true, but they included this wide range of claims that Tim Cook made. One is that the government is asking Apple to weaken its product, to take a product that it had been working diligently over time to make stronger and stronger the security protection, and now to make it weaker. A second objection that Apple raised is that if Apple does this for the United States government, how is it going to say no to other governments? So when China asks for this, or Saudi Arabia, or India, or North Korea, how does Apple say, no, we only do this for governments we like? And Apple has firmly maintained, including in court filings, that it has never before done this for a government anywhere. So the argument widely made, which is that they already do this for the Chinese, I have no idea whether it's true or not, but Apple has maintained, including under oath, that that is not true. Another argument that Apple made is that there was a First Amendment issue. I don't plan, although I'm happy in discussion to spend time on the First Amendment issue, but some courts have held that code is speech, and that therefore compelling a company to write code was just the same as if you made them go buy an ad in the New York Times or you made them subscribe to a principle they don't agree to, and therefore would be a violation of the First Amendment. The fourth argument that Apple made was that the All Writs Act simply didn't apply. And they got a lot of support for this in February 2016 when a magistrate in another case, this not involving the FBI, in New York, agreed that the All Writs Act could not be applied to compel a company to write software to break its own encryption. In fact, let me just quote again, if I can, from what the magistrate's opinion in the New York case. The implications of the government's position are so far-reaching, both in terms of what it would allow today and what it implies about congressional intent in 1789, as to produce impermissibly absurd results. By the way, raising the question, what is a permissibly absurd result from a law enforcement agency? Apple also made the argument, and this has been widely discussed, especially among people like you instead of people like me, that it was not possible for them to control the software specially created to weaken their security, that if they made it, it would eventually be found elsewhere, that it was not reasonable to think they could craft that software and only have it used once. Now, the FBI responded aggressively to this in court filings and said, look, we're not even asking you to tell us what the hack was. We're not telling you to tell us what the new software looked like. We're going to hand you the iPhone, you're going to install this software, and then you're going to hand it back to us, and we're going to take it and try to break it. But of course, problem being that when they took it back, they would have the software on the phone. And so Apple's claim that at least one copy of the software would then be out of their control at least had that much credibility, whatever the technical merits of the argument, and you may be kind enough to enlighten me, that if one creates software inside a company, it cannot be kept there. Another argument which Apple did not make, but many others have made on Apple's behalf, is that the government is asking Apple to do its own work. That effectively, the government could write its own software and then ask a court to order Apple to digitally sign it and then install it on the iPhone. That this is just a matter of the FBI saying it'll take us X number of millions of dollars to do that, and we'd rather shift that cost to you. You can do it less expensively. You already hire these people. Why don't you do it instead? This ended up coming into a variety of related arguments about the significant technical errors that the FBI had made both in the handling of the iPhone and in its technical briefs. The criticism of the comments in the briefs has been withering, but Apple in particular pointed out that a number of things which the FBI's forensic experts who work for the FBI said were true about the iPhone were not true about the iPhone, that they were simply technically wrong, and they filed documents with the court that seemed to show that. But of course, the big argument about the technical issue here was one of, had the FBI, by advising the San Bernardino Police Department to reset the iPhone, had therefore made it impossible to use the automatic iPhone backup, which would have worked had the phone been connected to, had a wireless connection that it had previously connected to, it would have automatically backed up without re-entering the passcode. And then there would have been a clean copy of the information the FBI wanted. The FBI instead advised San Bernardino, either not aware of this or not remembering that it was aware of this, to reset the password, thinking that would somehow make it easier, and that made that approach impossible. So this really relates to the question, again, and Apple did raise this point, that effectively it was the government's fault that Apple was in this position. That in fact Apple had given the government 4 suggestions for how it might get in. Let me just pause and say, companies cooperate with the FBI every day, no matter what you might think or they might like to lead you to think. The FBI has a beautiful office on Microsoft's campus. Child pornography in particular is one thing that seems to unite law enforcement and people who write code. And all of the companies that write code report incidents of child pornography to the FBI on a daily basis. And so cooperation between law enforcement and these companies, even though these companies often sue the FBI as well, it's one of the beautiful, complicating things about US democracy, that you can cooperate on one hand and litigate on the other. But in this case, Apple had given the FBI 4 suggestions, and it turned out the FBI had already screwed up the first one, the most obvious one, the one that would have been most likely to have provided access. Finally, the argument was raised, although not in any court filings, but just by the subsequent facts. And that was, did it really need this way in? Now, there are a number of reasons why it might not have needed the way in. One was, of course, it had access to a fair amount of the data already, including the most recent backup, which was 5 weeks earlier. Another, which is what resulted in the New York case. In the New York case, where the government was actively seeking to compel Apple to break into a law firm in a drug-related case, it ultimately got the password from the defendant. It negotiated for it. It plea bargained for it, and it got the password. So that at least in one case where the government said, we absolutely have no other alternative, it turned out not to be true. They hadn't asked the person who knew the password. In this case, of course, the person who knew the password was dead. And so that seemed unlikely to be availing. But it did raise this question about whether the FBI was seeking something that it really needed. Again, exemplified by the fact that the FBI disclosed to the court that it had collected 4,000 iPhones since October. That's between October and February. It had accessed 3,500 of them with no difficulty whatsoever. And in the case of 500, it could not access them without help from some outside authority. But who were these other outside authorities? Well, this ultimately, of course, became the solution in this case, as you know, which is the FBI paid more than $1.3 million to buy a hack from a third party to break into this iPhone. And then just to complete this narrative, and I know for some of you this is tedious because you know this narrative well, the FBI then refused to tell Apple what the hack was. Now, you might say, what's so surprising about that? But there is something surprising about that, which is in 2014, the Obama administration put in place what it called an equities process in the White House, in which it would take undisclosed hacks. We thought at that time about the NSA, which knows a great deal about security vulnerabilities. It would take undisclosed hacks and make an administration-wide decision about when they should be disclosed. But at that time, the president's chief of staff said that the preference would be, the overwhelming preference would be for disclosing hacks in order to make the infrastructure safer. The FBI director, when asked about this, first said, what process, which was troubling, and later said that he didn't have to go through it because they didn't know the hack. They had just bought the right to use it. And so this is where we stand today. The hack, by the way, has not proved useful on the other phones that the FBI has tried to use it, and it has not been disclosed to Apple as far as we know. So One of the big challenges about this, and one of the sort of large themes that stands behind it, is this notion that the FBI has used since 2010 that the internet is going dark. And it's a very effective metaphor. It has worked extremely well with legislators. This notion that the internet, rather than having facilitated access to more data than ever before, that phones, rather than capturing more data than ever before, were somehow going to be inaccessible to law enforcement. So there would be a world in which terrorists and criminals and others would be communicating freely, and the FBI would have no vision into that, would have no light. The term was first used in testimony by the General Counsel of the FBI, Valerie Caproni, in 2010. It then sort of went in disuse for a while until Director James Comey took office, and he has crisscrossed the country giving speeches about going dark. The problem about this is, of course, the very subject is dark to most of us. You know, how much of communications, how much of digital data, how much of things the government might expect to have access to if given a court order or if given other authorization, does it really not have access to? The historical data on this is not overly convincing. You may remember the Clipper chip debate during the Clinton administration. Some of you don't look old enough to remember the Clinton administration at all, but before Hillary Clinton ran for office, her husband served as president. You might have read about that somewhere. And law enforcement officials came up with the idea under his administration that there would be access available to chips that would be developed by the NSA, and that there would be secondary keys, not primary keys, but available that the government would hold in escrow until such time as a court granted legal authorization to have access to whatever data was being protected by that chip, and then one government agency would hand the key over to another government agency which would look at it. And interestingly, although the phrase going dark was not used at the time, the argument was very much similar. We face a world in which even when we get legal authorization, we won't be able to see these things. As you undoubtedly know, since you don't use Clipper chips today, that proposal failed miserably. It actually led to an amazing firestorm of opposition. It brought together all sorts of people who aren't normally good bedfellows. Conservatives and liberals joined hands in opposing the Clipper chip. And you know, the world has not come to an end since that happened. You know, we've had stronger and better encryption, and we do have a little bit of actual evidence. I don't know whether you'll consider this very compelling evidence or not, but federal law requires the government, when it seeks wiretap orders that authorize the government to tap somebody's telephone, whether a cell phone or a landline, to disclose the number of wiretaps to Congress, and to disclose at the same time the number of wiretaps that they were unable to execute because of encryption. So in other words, they got the information, but they couldn't make sense of it because they encountered encryption. So the last 4 years for which we have data, 2011 through 2014, in 2011, the government in state and federal court obtained authorization for 2,700 wiretaps, and it encountered encryption in 12 of those 2,700. I think that's technically 0%. In 2012, it got authorization for 3,400 wiretaps, and it encountered encryption in 15, but it was able to break it in all but 4 cases. In 2013, courts granted authorization for 3,500 wiretaps. Encryption was encountered in 41. This was a big spike, but the government was able to break it in all but 9 cases, so 9 out of 3,500. And then in 2014, the last year for which we have public data, there were, again, 3,500 wiretap authorizations granted. Only 25 did the federal or state government encounter encryption. and it was able to break it in all but 4. So at least for the moment, up through 2014, and in this area, 2 years back, could be ages, the government's had a pretty good run of being able to get access to that which it's been legally authorized to get access to. So in the event that we see more activity in this area, which I think is certain, I think we have to start thinking about what happens and then think about what happens to security as a result. So imagine what happens. So one thing is we're going to see encryption get more robust. Seems to be happening all the time. It seems unlikely that's not going to happen. And what we're going to see is service providers and manufacturers doing more and more to distance themselves from the keys. Nobody's going to want to hold the keys. Everyone's going to want the customer to hold the keys. I personally find this terrifying, the thought of holding my own keys so that when I lose them, I can no longer get access to my data. Literally, I mean, when I was first presented with the choice of using an online document sharing service, there were 2 I was pointed to, Dropbox and I think SpiderOak was the other one. Dropbox, they hold the keys. SpiderOak, you hold the keys. By the time I read all the disclaimers in SpiderOak about if you lost access to your keys, there was nothing they could do, you were screwed, I went with Dropbox. I'm like, look, I understand they've had a breach, got all that, but I don't want the responsibility of holding my own keys. So what we see is really enormous movement in this area with companies, partly as a result of the Snowden disclosures, partly a result of trade pressure from Europe, saying we want to provide stronger and stronger protection and we want to be farther and farther removed from the ability to penetrate it. If the government gets backdoor access, it seems reasonable, I would at least argue it's reasonable, and then invite anyone who wants to argue back that others will get that access as well. In fact, I read a wonderful article in today's New York Times. You can't have a backdoor that isn't a security vulnerability. This reporter was quoting an unnamed source. It's an important point. It's a very important point for this discussion. If you have backdoor access for one, you're going to have backdoor access for others. A third likely reality that's going to happen here is the FBI is going to get less cooperation from industry. Partly because the relationship is going to deteriorate, partly because it is going to be difficult for industry to be seen cooperating with the FBI, particularly when it comes to their international sales, their sales offshore, and those are the fastest growing areas for companies like Apple that make devices. If you cooperate with the FBI, why won't you cooperate with other law enforcement agencies? But here's the point I want to really focus on, which is you may know that Congress reacted with 2 bills, one of which has been leaked and the other of which has been publicly disclosed. The one that's been leaked by Senators Richard Burr and Dianne Feinstein have proposed legislation that would require that any communication service provider that provides encryption must, as a matter of law, retain the ability to provide plain text access to the federal government. That would therefore mean no letting the user hold the keys or backdoors built in. Now, understand that is just a bill. It's not passed anywhere. It's not even been formally introduced. But this is very much, these are 2 extremely influential senators, Dianne Feinstein and Richard Burr, chair and ranking minority leader on the Senate Intelligence Committee, that would require, as a matter of law, that a company that provides communication services to the public could not create a situation like Apple had, where it could not provide plain text to the government. The other bill was by Senator Mark Warner and Representative Mike McCall, and they did the classic Washington thing, which in this area might be the right thing, which is they said we need a commission on encryption filled with people who understand encryption and can therefore have a meaningful discussion about what might be available or in terms of alternatives. Now, I want to be absolutely clear here. I'm not in any way reaching a conclusion or a value judgment. Rather, the point on which I want to focus is the question of if cybersecurity is already at risk today, and I think we all have a pretty good sense that it is, how much more so will it be in a world in which encryption is either limited, not just limited in the ways that we currently limit it, you can't export certain encryption products and so forth, but limited in the sense that you might not even have access to certain types of encryption products. To what extent does that weaken our cyber infrastructure? And here, if I'm giving a sermon, I would say I take as my text today General Michael Hayden, not known as an enormous civil libertarian, former NSA director, former CIA director, who said in March that he supported Apple over the FBI's claims, not because he cared a bit about the privacy of the terrorist cell phone, but rather because the CIA considers cyber attacks the #1 threat to US security, and what the FBI was proposing would make those cyber attacks that much more possible. A second and related question, I'm going to leave these questions on the table, by the way. If I'm even remotely leading you to believe I'm going to answer them, I have misled you. What is the impact on security of taxpayer bounties on device vulnerabilities? In other words, to what extent do we want the federal government using taxpayer dollars to say, we'll pay people if they'll find or create ways into encrypted products, particularly if they don't disclose those ways in after they find them? Again, this may be, in fact, and some people, some very well-schooled cybersecurity experts have said, this is sort of the fair way in. In fact, this has also been sort of the position of a number of people at the NSA who have said, if we want access to your encrypted communications, we'll just do it the old-fashioned way. We will break your encryption. So maybe this is what the situation of the future is going to look like, which is the government's going to pay more and more either for its own coders, its own software engineers, its own computer scientists, or it's going to just offer a higher and higher bounty program, like it has done on criminals for years. You know, most wanted, $20 million, dead or alive. Saddam Hussein was the last one who fit that category. Now maybe we reach that on, you know, give me a hack for an iPhone 6 running, you know, 9.2.0. A third and related question is, where does metadata fit in all this? Now, usually if I were talking to state legislatures or to Congress, I would now have to explain what is metadata. In this case, I'm just going to assume that we're on safe ground about metadata as in this sense being data about the data being protected. We generally, in most devices, don't encrypt metadata. We didn't really understand until the Snowden disclosures how valuable metadata might be for intelligence gathering purposes anyway. Right now, metadata is pretty freely available to the government. It's neither encrypted in most cases, nor is it protected by strong federal law. You don't even need a court order to get metadata. Are we going to see encryption of metadata? What operational costs will that impose? Can you actually run a system that generates encrypted metadata? Are, you know, iPhones going to become large and bulky again? Or is metadata going to continue being available? Finally, I would just say that although this discussion and the whole fight between Apple and the FBI has focused on phones, you know, really just many computers that we carry around with us. Think about the world of sensors, the Internet of Things, a variety of sensors in which we're surrounding ourselves. Currently, almost none of these provide encryption. For good reason. Most of them, nobody's ever thought anyone would care about the data. But the obvious example, the one which I carry around with me, is an insulin pump, which is wirelessly addressable. It's addressable through Bluetooth, and it does not carry encryption. So as we think about the future and the tension between national security and cybersecurity, this is going to be an increasingly significant question. What about the types of data that we've never even thought about needing to protect? You might remember when the Anthem hack was made public, it appears relatively certain that this came from China and that the purpose was to obtain information about people who worked for the federal government or engaged in federal contracts. And the head of the NSA at the time said, "You got to really admire them. I wish I could do that." We appreciate this new frankness from the NSA. I almost liked it better when they felt like they shouldn't make public comments. But you know, this will be useful data. The data about what you put in your washing machine or what you have in your refrigerator or what medical devices you have on your body or you have in your home. This will be data with security implications, cybersecurity and national security. Finally, I just want to add a sort of a coda to this. And that is, remember, there are strong anti-encryption forces as well. Folks who worry about ease of access, about computational speed, about my concern about the irretrievability of my data. Consumers have not flocked to encryption. If given a choice, they have not used it. It's not like companies have been racing forward here until we got the Snowden disclosures and until we started having increasing pressure from groups largely focused on civil liberties and privacy, focused on this particular question of security. As a general matter, and my understanding is we have a reception after this, and I assume there will be alcohol, so I don't mind if I'm depressing. You'll have your chance to drink your way out of it. It seems pretty accurate to say we are not doing tremendously well in our fight to secure devices and data. I don't mean that we're not winning the majority of battles. We are, but it's such an asymmetric war that even if we only lose 1 out of 1,000 or 1 out of 100,000 or 1 out of 1,000,000, there's so much data. It's so widely accessible, so interconnected. This is going to allow for extraordinary vulnerabilities. Just look at the breaches around us. I keep looking at the Office of Personnel Management. You know, this was the one when we really thought data mattered, somebody would know how to secure it. You know, we're doing background checks on people for national security classifications. These are the most sensitive people in the country in terms of their vulnerability, and we are collecting their most personal information. That somebody would have said, you know, we know how to secure this, we're going to do that. Maybe this doesn't need to be internet connected. You know, it turns out we not only couldn't secure it, but it took us weeks, in fact, it took us months to discover the true extent of the damage that had been done when it was accessed. Again and again, we have been reminded by, I want to say people in authority, that may not mean very much in this community, but let me just remind you, for example, the White House in 2009 issued its cybersecurity report, sometimes called the 60-day report, because the president ordered the production of this report immediately after he came into office, and it was delivered within 60 days. And in that report, even after it was watered down by the White House because it was thought to be too alarmist, it said the architecture of the nation's digital infrastructure based largely upon the internet is not secure or resilient. Without major advances in the security of these systems or significant change in how they are constructed or operated, it is doubtful that the United States can protect itself from the growing threat of cybercrime and state-sponsored intrusions and operations. or former NSA Director Mike McConnell, who wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post in 2010, "The United States is fighting a cyber war today, and we are losing. It's that simple." Well, that's comforting. As the most wired nation on earth, he wrote, "We offer the most targets of significance, yet our cyber defenses are woefully lacking. The stakes are enormous." So it is against this backdrop that these questions about if the government, either through courts or legislatures, either can compel a company to weaken its security or can prohibit a company from having robust security altogether, what is the cost, potential or real, future or existing, to our cybersecurity, to securing the data and the infrastructure that plays such a critical role in our lives, in addition to the cost to privacy and civil liberties and other things? And how do we find a way to balance that, to assess that, to have any sort of rational policy-making or decision-making where that is brought into tension with national security? Now, I think what I'm going to do is stop there, partially because it may be possible to drink sooner if we end sooner, but mainly because I'm anxious to hear comments or questions or objections or additional information from you. And so I'd like to stop to allow that. Yeah, Steve. Oh, he gets a microphone? We'll never get out of here.
So one activity the government engages in is intentionally but secretly weakening technology. So for example, NIST publishes algorithms to produce pseudo-random numbers, and so any form of cryptography is only as good as its ability to find roughly random numbers. And then I believe it was the NSA paid one of the prominent, I think it was RSA, money to use the weak random number generator, and this is all under the covers. And so in addition to people requiring consumer devices, which is, as you put it, software in a computer, and there's plenty of software to do encryption, free open source software.
Right.
The government actively tries to weaken this, and is there a potential for, now that this issue's been brought up and people are making decisions, is there any sensitivity or awareness by the policymakers that it's not just this, they're actively doing it elsewhere?
I so want the answer to be yes. I'm trying to think of a way to reach that answer. I think there is certainly awareness. I don't think there's much sensitivity to it. In other words, I think these issues tend to be driven in policy circles by effectively a press cycle. So you have a controversy over Apple and FBI, and so we're going to focus on Apple and FBI. And then next year we'll have a controversy over something else, and we'll focus on that. It's actually one reason I'm a pretty big believer, although I usually hate things like committees or commissions, in the idea of a national commission of experts, not political leaders, but actual experts, and people from industry and academia and law enforcement who would sit down and tussle over these issues and try to figure out, is there any ground for accommodation, or are we just going to keep suing each other, which is, not really a victory for the FBI. In this case, I think they came out looking fairly embarrassed, but not really a victory for Apple either, except for the fact that they stood up. But at the end of the day, they had to publicly disclose that their product could be compromised for $1.3 million. And I don't think that probably made the shareholders very happy. I would just say one of the things we learned from Snowden was not only about the random number generator, but that the NSA had actually worked with NIST, had influenced NIST to actually weaken an encryption standard, which they published. And this too, raises a critical question about the NSA, a little bit beyond my subject today, but and that is it holds these twin missions. On the one hand, it is responsible for penetrating security. And on the other, it is responsible for ensuring security. And when the president appointed a review commission following the Snowden disclosures, it came back with a strong recommendation that those should be divided into two agencies, and the president rejected that right off the bat. They also argued that the NSA should not be headed by a military commander, but rather by a civilian commander, a civilian head, as is the case in many other countries. In fact, for many years, the head of the Australian Signals Directorate was a history professor, but it meant that, a smart history professor, let me say, but not a computer scientist and not a military person. But again, the president rejected that. So we have this now constant tension we're living with in maybe more places in government than I'm even giving credit to, between national security and cybersecurity, or infrastructure security, as I would prefer to think of it. Other comments or questions, please?
So from like a social informatics standpoint, sorry. So there's two ways we can go about this, right? We can keep mastering technology, keep developing technology, and then maybe keep exploiting or developing exploits where people can come through and, take advantage of that. Or we can, say like, let's slow down and let's, develop technology that we have now in a way where it mitigates any potential like cyber attacks or, hacking, stuff like that. Do you think we should keep advancing technology at the rate we're going, or do you think we should slow down and maybe reassess everything and, try to mitigate anything like that?
I think the first is inevitable. In other words, I don't think it's a choice, because there will be somebody pushing ahead on the technological front. So if we think that it's the Russian business mafia, or it's a Chinese unit of the People's Liberation Army, it doesn't matter who we think it is, then we're going to have to do it too. If we think they're doing it, we're going to have to do it and do it better. We may very ones be the ones doing it first. I'm not in any way casting aspersions on anyone here. And so therefore, I think it's a sort of runaway freight train in that sense. And one question which I hear technologists ask a lot, and I rarely even understand the question, but I have friends who explain it to me in small terms, is will advances in computing, for example, if we move into truly high performance exascale type computing or quantum computing, one of the things the NSA says publicly, quantum computing will mean the end of encryption as we know it. And in fact, there are discussions throughout the federal government in quantum resistant encryption. Now, since we don't yet have workable quantum computing, that's a little forward thinking. I understand it's a controversial technological subject, but again, I think one problem here that policymakers and judges and lawyers have in this area is we think of it as a static field. We don't know that in the 5 months it took to deal with the Apple situation, they issued 3 different sets of software for the iPhone. So we're arguing about something that was 2 years out of date when we started, but is 3 generations out of date by the time we finished.
So Fred, I want to go back to something you said earlier, that consumers, if given a choice, would not choose to do this. So I blame it on the Anthem hack, but my financial and medical data was compromised, as was my wife and my 5 kids. We've seen evidence for every one of us about someone using that for something, tax refunds, try to get medical services. So, why do I care? It's already out there. What am I trying to protect? And that seems to be the problem of the consumer, who believes if someone wants my information bad enough, they either already have it or they'll pay 10 cents for it, and why should I care? So a little different than the technology question, but just where's the support for this going to come from? Is it just in the government? And if the consumer is such a huge market, why is no one convincing me I should continue to care, even though I filed taxes in 5 states this year? I got no refund, by the way.
And you're still claiming that it wasn't you who made all those purchases. I just wanted to know.
For the record, sure.
So let me say, first of all, I'm not sure the public's going to care. And to a certain extent, I think we have, I don't want to say wasted, that's an overly pejorative term, and I don't in any way mean that. But I think a lot of our efforts to like educate the public and get them upset about this, it just hasn't worked. I mean, look, we know, we have authoritative evidence. If you impose a delay between an individual and a purchase they want to make on the internet of 7 seconds or longer, they will walk away from the transaction. So what company in its right mind is going to say, oh no, you know, this is the time to pull out your key and you know? And so, for example, what Amazon has been saying publicly for years is, you require us to do it, we'll do it because everyone will do it and consumers then can't go anywhere else. But if you think we're going to be the only ones to do it, forget it. And so even companies that have rolled out multi-factor authentication and so forth outside of the financial services industry where it's required have done it on a purely voluntary basis generally. You know, Google will let you do it, but they don't require you to use it. So I think part of the question is we have to get beyond the sort of individual as the, I understand in the market the individual is critical because the individual makes purchasing decisions, but in terms of setting security standards or identifying good behaviors, I just think individuals are, without question, the worst possible source of identifying those. The other thing I would say, and this is way off, and I see cameras there, which makes me incredibly nervous to be saying this publicly because I'll be humiliated by it, not just today, but again and again. I think we have to really start thinking about our whole infrastructure around data. So we have used data as if it was somehow reliable for years, and it's not. It's just not. And we've endured hundreds of millions of dollars of fraud as a result of that. But of course, we've generated trillions of dollars of payments, so it was just a cost worth. So I can remember NB&A, a company that's no longer in existence, so I'm free to talk about them publicly, once saying to me when I was meeting with them as part of a project, a research project I was doing, that their annual fraud loss was about $400 million a year. And my mouth fell open, and they're like, yeah, but we process $1.3 trillion in credit card payments. That's like nothing. That's a... we don't even show that on our annual filings. It's such a small amount. Well, what's happening now is the ability to make more use of the data, to make it more valuable, is going to start raising those numbers. And so far, we've not been good at counting them. So MB&A was telling me its fraud loss, but you're telling me your loss plus a bunch of other companies' losses, and those aren't being collected. We don't have any law right now that requires anyone outside of financial services to report fraud losses. So, we don't know if Target loses $400 million a year of frauds. We'll never know that. They don't have to tell us that. And so as a result, I think what we're going to see is that people will, that businesses are going to fundamentally take a step back on the current information infrastructure. And that may mean some current conveniences go away. You can just buy anything online instantly, automatically, buy a house, no problem at all, get a $200,000 mortgage, may take you 15 seconds. That we're going to say, wait a minute, unless your computer has some really strong identification technologies and really strong protection, we're just not going to let you do it. I remember at IU when we had a major, thoughtful, detailed discussion about scanning email. Could we block email that contained malicious code? We're a public institution, we're subject to the Fourth Amendment. This was a really serious discussion. Well, now, 10 years later or 15 years later, I don't remember when the discussion was, we don't think anything about it. We block hundreds of millions of emails because they have malicious code. I would suspect that other things we take as given today, like every individual gets to control their own phone or you get to control your own computer, those may change as well. Those may go the way of cars. Remember, cars you used to be able to customize indefinitely. You could pick this with that and this with that. Then many car manufacturers said, no, we're going to offer 6 models. This is how they are. You can have the EX, the EXL, the EXEL6. That's it. That's all we're offering. And it's unthinkable right now because we think of computers as so individualized, that we individualize everything, but that it may become much more standardized or regulated. And we may not like it. I'm not saying this will necessarily be good, but it will depend on what those regulations are. Oh, that was really depressing. Other comments? Yes, please, right there.
In a similar vein, I guess, this past October, there was a legal deadline for stores to implement chip readers, and more than 6 months later, most of the places I shop still don't have them, even though they're financially responsible for anything that happens. So with cybersecurity, are we going to see the same thing where getting the infrastructure in place is just too expensive and places will just take the fines if something happens?
So this is a great question, and this is well, how much time do I have? Really, I could go on forever about the whole thing about chip and also the role of regulation in encouraging good cybersecurity. Here's what I think is going to happen, which is, to date, as I keep saying, much to the annoyance probably of my colleagues who work in security, I just don't think we've taken cybersecurity very seriously, and frankly, it's because it hasn't cost us that much. Look at Target, the major, huge, publicized breach cost its CEO his job, cost its CIO his job, cost the company $40 million, maybe $50 million. For a company like Target, it was it was like a bad investment in a store. It was not a big deal. And so what we're going to end up seeing, I would guess, is it's going to start costing more and more, and it won't be fines, I'm guessing, it will be real losses. Right now, we have sort of a complicated loss shifting system in the United States. For consumers, if you use a credit card, you bear no loss. The loss is all borne by either the merchant or the bank. So that's made consumers, A, carry a lot more stuff than we need, and B, it means we are understandably cavalier about it. I'll tell you my credit card number right now, because if you use it fraudulently, I won't pay anything. Why should it bother me? Right? However, that has been an important dynamic for maybe 25 years. Now the dynamic's becoming who in industry has to pay that loss. Is it the bank? Is it the card issuer? Is it the company that has the non-working chip reader? And as those losses go up, I think this is going to start leading companies to say, we're now going to invest seriously in cybersecurity. So why haven't we had chip and pin for years? We still don't have chip and pin because it costs too much. The infrastructure is too high. But that's not a reasonable thing to say, it costs too much. What we have to say is it costs more than the benefit is. But as the cost of cyber attacks goes up, I think the cost of chip and pin is going to look trivial by comparison. But it is astonishing that it's taken us 12 years longer than Europe to roll out chip cards, and that even then we somehow forgot the pen thing, which is what makes it multi-factor authentication and work. And we look like idiots. I mean, I don't know what else to say. And we'll just keep paying the fraud loss until we do that. By the way, can I just say, since nobody else is saying anything, and you don't actually get to drink early, I've been told I have to keep going. The other issue that we see about the whole chip rollout is, of course, even stores that did update their technology to have chip readers, the overall system has been so slow that consumers hate them with a passion. 15 seconds and longer to get a chip read. Now, interestingly, in Europe, where chip and pin was invented, it's covered by a French patent, which is a reason to dislike it on its own. But anyway, it was implemented because they had such a crappy telecommunication system, they need something that would authenticate locally. We chose to implement chip without pin, which was weaker, and then to say, we're still going to make it check with a central computer. So we've got the worst of all worlds now. We have less good security, and we have the delay. And as a result, the public is going to really react badly when we say, oh, and by the way, now you have to remember a PIN as well. Fortunately, you're going to have at least 15 seconds to look it up because the system's so slow. Yes, please. Oh, wait, someone's going to hand you a microphone. Perfect.
So how much of a solution are things like Apple Pay with the unique transaction numbers and stuff?
I don't know is the answer. It doesn't mean I'm not going to say something about it, but I just want to be honest that everything else I say follows I don't know. The problem is for most of us is we use things like Apple Pay linked to either a credit card or a bank. So the Apple Pay system may be more secure, but the infrastructure behind it, the infrastructure that connects us to it, is still the same bad infrastructure that we're still using. And so I think the question is going to be, and this is why I don't know the answer, does it matter to secure one link in the chain if you've left such an other visible huge link still unsecured? And time will tell. It's been interesting. We've actually seen a sort of visible demonstration of the odd incentives this has created. You know, Starbucks has a pay app. You pay by linking it to a credit card or a bank account. There's been a fair amount of fraud on this Starbucks app. And the question is, who should do something about it? And Starbucks is like, well, it's not our fraud, it's the fraud on the bank. Why should we do something about it? Customers love using this app. And the banks are saying, wait a minute, you're the ones running the insecure system that's letting this app connect in a way so that other people get access to the person's iPhone, get the bank information off of it, through the Starbucks system, and so you are the avenue through which the fraud is occurring. But Starbucks says, we're not paying for the fraud. We don't know what you're talking about, you know? So it's not that these are bad companies. It's that, you know, they make data-based decisions, and the data don't drive them always to do the right thing, which is why either overwhelming fraud or a major, you know, terrorist attack that exploits infrastructure or some huge sweeping law is more likely, I think, to probably change behaviors. Okay, anything else? I know you can just taste those drinks. Well, you can say something and I'll repeat it to be whatever I want it to be.
So we've talked about you know, a terrorist cell phone and someone at Starbucks getting a free cup of coffee, right? How related are these two things really? I mean, the government may do something about one, maybe not likely about the other. So are we talking years or decades before I can't get free coffee or I can't be a terrorist? I mean, and kind of serious here. I mean, the terrorists are listening to this as we speak, thinking, gosh, I should talk to this Fred guy, or at least hack his phone and see what he's thinking, because he's really smart. And they're going to be, you know, way ahead of most things. They have a lot of money, do things they want to do. But where are we in the time scale of what we're going to fix and how? It just seems that this is a perpetual problem.
Yeah, I mean, you're of course right. I think it will depend on what happens next. In other words, another 9/11 that has a cyber element to it, and I think we'll start fixing this stuff really fast, and we'll shut down your iPhone so fast it'll make your head spin if that's what's needed to do it. Just like we did after 9/11. I mean, remember, we as a country did all sorts of things we would have said absolutely we would never do. That would never happen here, and we did it all after a major terrorist attack. And again, I don't mean that critically. I think we should expect that's exactly what will happen again. In a way, I think one of the great questions, again, I see the cameras and sort of, I'll just pretend they're not there, is why haven't terrorists taken more advantage of this incredibly fragile and weak data infrastructure? And there's a lot written about this. I mean, partly that they like big visible things, you know, the planes blowing up, shootings in public squares. But you know, sooner or later, someone's going to catch on. There's a real vulnerability here, and think about how easily we already destabilize things like our utilities network or our financial markets. You know, the president yawns and the stock prices fall 4%. Well, it wouldn't take much if suddenly the New York Stock Exchange said, we're not absolutely sure we can verify trades that occurred yesterday. You know, the market could fall by a third. In a day, in a single day, and in terms of economic impact on the country, it would be far more than the World Trade Center tower, and it could cost lives as well. or attacking medical infrastructure, or other types of infrastructure. As this is what I keep thinking about as we move towards autonomous vehicles or everybody owning their own drone. That's just what I like. We've identified we do not know how to secure infrastructure, so let's make computers run our cars now that we don't know how to secure them. It's a kind of frightening thought, and I think eventually we will either act so stupidly or terrorists will catch on, and then we may see something. I don't wish that. Let me be absolutely clear. I just think it's inevitable. But until that happens, I suspect this could drag on forever. And in terms of the interconnectedness, the only thing I would say is this. For a long time, we've looked at fraud. I've done a lot of research about fraud. There are other people who have done far more than I have. And fraud's been a fairly, I want to call it a quick event. In other words, somebody steals your data, they usually use it within days. They don't store it up. I'm sure you know there are markets for stolen data. You can go online today, you can buy credit card numbers by the thousand. The price you pay depends on whether there's an expiration date attached to them, or if they have the CCV code, the price goes up maybe fivefold. But that data is exploited quickly because people change their credit card numbers. Credit card numbers change all the time. So we've had a sort of comfort, like breach, data, fraud, over. But the way that nation states might use data is not like that. So, if the Chinese got 70 million records from Anthem, and they didn't exploit any of them, as far as we know, not one. We have no recorded fraud that we can link to Anthem for certain. But if they're building the perfect phishing message to send the guy who controls the stealth bomber program, the cost could be enormous. And so given that we have seen successful phishing attacks at the heart of virtually every published successful attack that has involved any form of stolen data, I think that's what in a way we have to be worried about. And that is that it's longer term uses of the data. And you don't change your name, and it's very hard to change your social security number in this society. And a lot of people don't change their addresses. And so if I've gotten all this information out of your Anthem file, I may not use it for a decade. I'm going to wait for you to get promoted. I mean, I admire you now, but when you go to your next job, I'm really going to use the data. I think that's the sort of thing we have to worry about, where the shelf life of the data, and that's why I say I think we may very well see changes to our data infrastructure so that we make data less useful. Right? So like, why are social security numbers so valuable? It's because we use them for things we probably shouldn't use them for. I remember, well, in fact, even today, it's still a fight within the Army about social security numbers not being on dog tags, not being on laundry bags. Up until a decade ago, we published the social security number in the Federal Register of every general officer upon their promotion. That's how we listed them, General John Smith, social security number. And then we had banks using social security numbers as default passwords. Well, this was just a train wreck. I mean, you didn't have to be a genius to see there's a problem here. We've made these things public, and then somebody used them as default passwords. We do that, I think, with a lot of infrastructure. Resetting passwords. I reset my passwords every single day. I can't remember my password for anything. Not a problem, I just reset it. But what do they ask me to reset it? Something I got out of your Anthem file. I mean, so again, we have built this infrastructure as a society. I don't mean ILITE or the university or the state. As an entire collection of folks, we have built an infrastructure that is irrational when it comes to the way it manages data. And we're reaping the cost for that. Okay, that was really cheerful. Yes, say something happy. Comment on the beautiful weather. Okay, well, I'm ready to take you on. Who can be more depressing here?
So when you talk about infrastructure security from a sort of fundamental level, isn't that's based on some of those fundamental principles of that are trust and identity, right? You are who you say you are because I trust this guy who says, yeah, he is who he say. That whole certificate authority. So that identity, that's sort of antithetical to a lot of people's mentalities about how the internet should work, yes. Right? And also it relies on this fundamental trust of a central organization that will say, yes, they are or are not who they say they are. I don't think most people, at least like me who grew up in the 90s, viewed the internet was the wild, wild west, yeah. Right? And we all know who worked in IT that it's not anonymous, but the perception is that there's an anonymity which sort of equalizes things and gives you some freedoms and protections, and that obviously goes away as far as the anonymity, but also that, okay, who are we going to trust to be that central repository of, yes, they are who they say they are. I mean, I feel like those two issues kind of spell doom for any sort of fundamental security on the intervening infrastructure. Now, end-to-end security might be a different thing. You know, my device is mine and it's secure and his is, and then we can, but the intervening infrastructure maybe can't really play a role in that because of those two issues. What do you think?
I think you're probably right. I'm just not gonna say anything hopeful. I'm sorry. But I would say you have really illustrated perfect examples, frankly, far better than I had, about how really irrational our infrastructure is. So think about it. One of our major challenges today is how do you identify people? Online or off, it doesn't matter. It's an absolute, you have to identify yourself at the airport, you have to identify yourself to log in, you have to identify yourself all the time. And what do we use as our foundational identity documents? Well, what do you use to get a driver's license in the state of Indiana? Yes, exactly, because you look so much like you did when your birth certificate, oh no, your picture's not even on your birth certificate. So our feeder documents, the documents on which everything else is based, are utter and unmitigated crap, without exception. And yet, we also let every state issue its own. Because the best thing that you can do to make crap even worse is to have a multiple variety of crap. So this is what I mean about we might see a change to our infrastructure. I would not at all be surprised to see a national ID card. Maybe even including a national ID card that would use biometrics in a potentially intrusive way. Now, would that be good or bad? I don't know. I mean, I could argue on both sides of that, but it has been a long tradition in this country that we will not allow a federal ID card, and yet we make everyone identify themselves every time they do absolutely anything. I can't go see my doctor without another photocopy of my driver's license. And so it's just bizarre. We should either get rid of that infrastructure. You know, let's just stop pretending that we're identifying people. Maybe we don't need to know who you are when you fly. I mean, really, the terrorist watch list has not been a great success. And interestingly, terrorists don't provide their social security numbers or their birth dates. So if we think we're matching by birth date, it's not. I mean, it's just not. And so maybe we should just back down. I mean, one thought would be to say, we could be rational by being stronger. We could also be rational by just being rational and accepting the current weakness. But my guess is we're going to get to stronger because we're going to be driven to it, whether we like it or not. And so, for example, the internet, you know, as you mentioned, the internet was established in a way that makes identity verification effectively impossible. It can be reestablished. And what will it take to do that? I mean, simultaneous terrorist attacks in North America and Europe. You know, what will it be before all those proposals that law enforcement officials have been pushing for years suddenly get traction? And remember, that's exactly what happened with the Patriot Act. You know, every word of the Patriot Act had been written decades before, been tried and failed, try and fail. 9/11 happened, they put out the fires and they showed up at Congress the next week with a 400-page bill. That's how these laws get made. And I think we could easily be headed there. It's another reason to try to get it right while we still have a chance to make improvements. Get it right's impossible, of course, but to get it better before we have a dramatic overreaction. Okay, are you done with me?
Well, we hope you'll join us.
I'm coming for drinks. In fact, somebody gave me a free drink tag. I'm so excited about that. Thank you very much.